are outraged by what's going on here in Washington. They have a hard time understanding why right-wing extremists in the Republican Party in the House are able to shut down the United States government, deny paychecks to millions of federal employees, and at the same time threaten services, in some cases desperately needed services, to tens of millions of Americans. So the people are hurting, and they wonder what's going on. Let me just try to say a few words as to my views as to, in fact, what has happened. For a beginning, when some of my Republican colleagues are saying, well, we just need to talk, let's compromise, a key point they neglect to make is that a major compromise has already taken place. The Democrats in the Senate, and I'm an independent, as you are, affiliated with the Democratic caucus, decided to send a budget for a continuing resolution to the House, which, in my view, was a very, very weak budget, one that I am totally dissatisfied with, and I think most members of the caucus are. It continues the budget at sequestration levels, which will have a devastating impact on this country. It is a bad budget. But the reason that the majority leader sent it over to the House was that he was under the understanding that the Speaker of the House had requested that type of budget, and that once that budget came over, that CR came over, that the House would agree to it. In fact, let me read from an article in the Washington Post today, commenting on an ABC interview that Speaker Boehner did. And the Washington Post says, in the ABC interview, Boehner tacitly acknowledged making a deal with Senate Democrats to avoid using the threat of a shutdown to attack Obamacare in exchange for an agreement to maintain the deep cuts known as the sequester through the fall. He conceded that his rank and file forced him on to the path to shutdown by insisting on waging the fight over Obamacare. End of quote. Washington Post today. Well, what does that mean? It means that an agreement had been reached by the Speaker and the Majority Leader that if the Democrats accepted the very low budget that the Republicans wanted, that there would be a clean continuing resolution. And what this article points out, and what I think the Speaker has virtually acknowledged, that despite his agreement with the Majority Leader here in the Senate, he couldn't carry it out because his extreme right wing said, well, thanks, you got us the budget that we wanted, the CR that we wanted, that's not enough. Now we want to end Obamacare. And that's where we are today. So anyone who comes forward and says, well, why don't you talk? Why don't you compromise? The fact of the matter is, and I think the Majority Leader has made this point, that he compromised far more than many of us felt comfortable with. A compromise has already been reached. The Democrats accepted, in my view, a very bad and weak Republican budget. But it was done with the hope and the understanding that there would be a clean, continuing resolution and that the United States government would not be shut down. That's point number one. Point number two is the Speaker the other day on TV said there are not the votes to pass a clean CR. Well, what I have been hearing here on the floor of the Senate and in the House is that you have Republicans who are not sympathetic to Obamacare. They don't like Obamacare. They would like to defund Obamacare. But they understand that you don't shut down the United States government. You don't threaten that for the first time in the history of the United States, we may not pay our bills, be a deadbeat nation, and drive our economy and our financial system and perhaps the entire world's financial system into a catastrophic area by not paying our bills. And we believe that, in fact, there are enough Republicans in the House to join with Democrats and, in fact, pass a clean CR. I think the President has made the point, and the Majority Leader has made the point, is have the vote. Have the vote, Mr. Speaker. And maybe you're right, maybe you're not, but we don't know until you have the vote. And I would urge, as I have before, that the Speaker of the House function as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and not as the Speaker of the Republican Party. The last point that I want to make touches on an article that appeared in yesterday's New York Times. And it's a very important article because it really tells us who is behind this shutdown and what their motives are. If anybody thinks that this government shutdown or the threats about not paying our bills and driving the world's economy into catastrophic areas, thinks that this is an idea that just occurred the other day, that a senator had this bright idea, you would be very, very mistaken. The fact of the matter is that we have a growing right-wing movement in this country funded by some of the wealthiest people in America, including the Koch brothers, a family that has made their money in fossil fuels and are worth over $70 billion. $70 billion is their worth. And they are worth $70 billion. They have access to the best health care in the world. They have access to the best housing in the world. Their family members can go to the best colleges and universities in the world. But they are obsessed by, among other things, making sure that 20 or 25 million Americans have no health insurance at all. Now, I am a strong supporter of a Medicare for All single-payer program. I don't think that the Affordable Care Act went far enough. But to say the least, that when 20 or 25 million Americans can finally have access to health insurance, go to the doctor when they need to go to that doctor, make sure that there are no regulations that prevent them from getting care because of pre-existing conditions. Can you imagine, Mr. President, billionaires going to war against working people so that they and their kids cannot get health insurance? I mean, I think that is just obscene. That is just obscene. So let me just quote from the New York Times of yesterday. And it's important that people understand that the fight against the Affordable Care Act really is just the tip of the iceberg. That you have families and billionaires like the Koch brothers who not only want to see that we don't expand health insurance in this country, they have a long list of issues that they're going after. In fact, they want to repeal virtually every major piece of legislation passed in the last 80 years that protect the middle class and working families, women, children, the elderly, the sick, and the poor. That is their agenda. That is their agenda. So it's not a question of opposing the extension of health insurance through Obamacare. That's not enough for them. What they want to do is end Medicare as we know it right now, transform it into a voucher system, give an elderly person $8,000 who's dealing with cancer and say, good luck to you. They want to make massive cuts in Medicaid. They don't want to expand Medicaid, massive cuts. They are very clear about wanting to end Social Security. They don't believe the federal government should be involved in retirement issues and Social Security. One of the more amazing things of what these guys want to do, and many of our Republican colleagues apparently have drank the lemonade on this issue, is they want to abolish the concept of the minimum wage. Minimum wage now federally is $7.25 an hour. People can't live on that. And their idea is to get the federal government out of the minimum wage issue, no floor, so that if an employer in a hard-pressed area in Maine or in Vermont or in Michigan can pay people $4 an hour, they think that's freedom. You have the freedom to work for $4 an hour. We don't want a federal minimum wage. So in other words, what these right-wing extremists and the big money behind them, they have a major agenda of which repealing Obamacare is just one small part of it. Let me just quote, if I might, and I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to submit the entire New York Times article into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me just quote from the article, yesterday's New York Times. The current budget brinksmanship is just the latest development in a well-financed, broad-based assault on the health law, Mr. Obama's signature legislative initiatives. Groups like Tea Party Patriots, Americans for Prosperity, and Freedom Works are all immersed in the fight, as is Club for Growth, a business-backed nonprofit organization. Some, like Generation Opportunity and Young Americans for Liberty, both aimed at young adults, are upstarts. Heritage Action is new, funded in 2010 to advance the policy prescriptions of its sister group, the Heritage Foundation. The billionaire Koch brothers, Charles and David, have been deeply involved with financing the overall effort. Let me repeat that. The billionaire Koch brothers, Charles and David, have been deeply involved with financing the overall effort. Remember, these are the guys who are worth $70 billion, who want to essentially repeal every major piece of legislation protecting working families over the last 80 years. And let me go back to the article. Quote, a group linked to the Kochs, Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce, dispersed more than $200 million last year, $200 million last year, to nonprofit organizations involved in the fight, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to go to another paragraph, and this is really interesting and really important. The groups have also sought to pressure vulnerable Republican members of Congress with scorecards keeping track of their health care votes, have burned faux Obama cards on college campuses, and have distributed scripts of phone calls to congressional offices, sample letters to editors, and Twitter and Facebook offerings for followers to present as their own. What's going on here? What does that mean? This is what it means. As a result of the disastrous Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United, what billionaires like the Koch brothers and others can do, and what they are doing today, is saying to Republicans in the House of Representatives, if you vote for a clean, continuing resolution, if you vote to keep the government open, if you make it very clear that you will oppose any effort to see the United States default on its debts, if you do that, let me tell you what's going to happen to you. Because we have the Koch brothers and people worth billions of dollars who are prepared to jump into your campaign, perhaps to get a primary opponent against you and to fund that opponent with as much money as he or she needs. So what democracy now in the House, as a result of Citizens United, is about is a handful of billionaires can threaten any member of the House with defeat by pouring in unlimited sums of money if they vote in a way that the Koch brothers do not like. Now, if that's how people think American democracy is supposed to function, it would surprise me very much. That's not what American democracy is supposed to be about. And, Mr. President, that tells me again why we have got to do everything that we can to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision so that a handful of billionaires cannot dictate public policy here in the United States of America and in the United States Congress. Let me just conclude, Mr. President, by saying this. The American people are angry and they are frustrated, and I think what they are seeing is that the middle class of this country is disappearing, In fact, in the last 24 years, median family income today is lower than it was. It's gone down. You have millions of people who are out there working for wages that they just can't raise a family on. You're seeing right now a growth in poverty among elderly people. And in the midst of the disappearing middle class and in the increase of poverty, you're seeing more income and wealth inequality in this country than we have seen since the 1920s. Gap between the very rich and everybody else goes wider. And now, as I mentioned a moment ago, what these billionaires are doing with their money is continuing their war against the middle class by trying to repeal important pieces of legislation. And what the American people are saying, what about us? What about us? Who is worried that my kid who graduated high school can't find a job? Who is worried that my other kid who graduated college is leaving school deeply in debt? Who is worried that in our country we are not being aggressive in dealing with the issue of global warming? There are enormous issues facing the middle class in this country. The need to create millions of jobs, the need to raise the minimum wage, the need to make college affordable, the need to significantly improve child care in this country and education in general. There is an enormous amount of work to be done. What this Congress should not be doing is telling 2 million workers that you're not getting paid, furloughing what was then 800,000, now 400,000 workers. That's not what we should be doing. So, Mr. President, I hope that the American people stand up and make it clear to our Republican friends that they cannot shut down the government because they are not getting their way. And I would hope the American people would do everything they can to demand that this Congress start doing its job, which is to represent working families in this country. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.